Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I'm going to be talking about my favourite non-fiction reads from across the year. And again, like with the fiction one, these are books that have left an impact in a certain way. This is not to say that these are the only 12 good books I read across the year. In fact, there were many, many others that didn't make the list for whatever reason, but these are books that stuck with me for whatever reason. And yeah, I'm really excited to talk about them. I think it's been such a good year for non-fiction. I tend to read more fiction than non-fiction, and so there are plenty of big hitters from this year that I've probably missed, but I am excited to talk about them regardless, and so let's get started. I'm also going to say right from the jump, you'll notice a few trends across these. Firstly, that many of them are from the Women's Prize non-fiction shortlist and long list, just because I think there were so many fantastic books that came out from that have really been pivotal parts of my reading year. Also, a lot of the ones that weren't from that are generally tend to be about queer lives in some form, and so that's also to be expected that there will be a fair bit of that going on. I realize that it may not be the most representative list of what else was happening in non-fiction across the year. It's very much dominated by those two things, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because all of them were fantastic as well. And equally, I'd love to hear your recommendations in the comments and everything below, because I'm sure there are plenty of incredible books from across the year that I've not even heard of, never mind read. Well, after that intro, let's start off with something that's neither of those. My Good Bright Wolf by Sarah Moss. And Sarah Moss is a novelist, well, a writer whose work I've adored, particularly her fiction. I have absolutely inhaled her fiction from the last few years. I find her such an interesting and compelling writer. And in My Good Bright Wolf, she writes non-fiction about something really intensely personal. And I found this as a form of memoir so fascinating, because in many ways it's a conversation between her and herself within the book. She is having various conversations about her mental health, and essentially this wolf on her shoulder, or kind of other figure on her shoulder, is some form of dark and negative version of her self-talk. So, I mean, as you can tell, not an easy read at all, but a really compelling and interesting one, where she writes about the various demons that haunt her, in particular within this book, mental health, eating disorders, various other things. And the book is almost her negotiating with that voice to be able to get things done. And in many ways also provides context behind the timings where she was writing certain novels. And from her novels, they can be incredibly dark. They have many features to them that are incredibly gristly and difficult. And in My Good Bright Wolf, she, I think, really beautifully and painfully describes what was going on for her personally and professionally around those novels. But in doing so, writes this book that is such a rallying call for greater understanding. I just think this is a fantastic piece of writing. It's so difficult, and if I mean, I will say, if this is a book where you are personally affected by those issues, I don't think this is a very easily readable book for you, and I totally understand if it's not one that you can pick up, or where you might need to take several breaks, but I think it's an incredible piece of writing nonetheless. For the next book, I'm sort of cheating because this is basically a 2-in-1, but it felt weird to have this take up 2 spots. So technically it's a top 13 instead of top 12. Hopefully no triskaidekaphobes out there. But anyway, Some Men in London by Peter Parker. And this 2-volume series is a really remarkable piece of queer history, I think. It purposely examines the period from 1945, the end of World War II, to 1967, where the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality was passed in the UK. And this book intentionally narrows its focus not only by that time, but also to gay men and London in that time. And again, although that doesn't feel particularly representative, I went to an event where the author was speaking, where the editor, Peter Parker, was talking about this. And he explicitly mentions that he had to narrow it down, because to do an entire history of the whole of the UK or a broader time period would just be so many volumes, it would be untenable. And in some ways, having London as the focus, and obviously London is almost always the focus of things in the UK, but having London as the focus was also important, because not only is that the seat of Parliament, and where, you know, particularly this is a lot of legal changes, but many of the figures he wanted to write about were figures who often had to go to London because that's where a lot of the queer life was. And so he writes this really, he kind of edits this really intelligent set of volumes. And I think what's so interesting about it, and again, he mentioned this in the talk I went to, he intentionally focused on things that happened at the time. So really contemporaneous sources, contemporary sources for everything he was writing. So we're not seeing somebody in the 70s looking back at the 60s and saying, oh, what a wonderful time we had, it was great, look at these things. It's people of that moment talking about what happened to them. So it's a diary entry or an excerpt from a play or a newspaper article or a letter to a newspaper or a court proceeding or all of those sorts of things, all to really get a picture of what was going on. And what we do see in this set of volumes is something really quite incredible, because you have the stories of people who were there reacting without knowing what's coming next. So people in the 50s talking about how, you know, they have been arrested for cottaging or soliciting or whatever, not knowing what the change in law might be. And that in many ways starts setting the precedent for what comes later. Those are the people whose records go on to be part of lawmaking, because people talking about being blackmailed for being gay or being seen to be gay then go on to form a lot of the backbone of the decriminalization, because a big part of it was to try and stop blackmailing. It was seen as if you stop the thing being illegal, then blackmailing loses a lot of its punch. And I think this volume is just so beautiful. These two volumes are so beautiful because you have tales of people, you know, diary entries of people talking about being in fear in the most horrific ways, but also this joy of being able to go out to these undercover bars and live this life that we thought was maybe impossible at the time, and actually lots of people were doing it and lots of people were enjoying themselves in a way as well. So I just really enjoyed this. I think as a lover of queer history and as a gay man in London, I think these two volumes really spoke to me in a really special way. Next up, we have another memoir, and this time Karen McLeod with Lifting Off. And this I just thought was so beautiful and powerful. It's a memoir of when she worked as a flight attendant. And don't let that fool you by thinking, well, I'm not that interested in air travel or whatever. This is in many ways about the development and coming to understand herself of Karen McLeod herself. She writes about, really candidly actually, she writes about her struggles with alcohol, her early romantic relationships, and particularly how those went hand in hand with the lifestyle of being a flight attendant. So there's this fear that, you know, she was going to miss out, and so she had to do these things, and she would travel, and she was constantly in a state of unrest because she didn't really know where she was or who she was. Her sense of work and play was completely enmeshed with each other, because if most of your social life is going out with other flight attendants, if most of your romantic life is dating other people in the industry, then it really starts to blur everything in your life. And particularly, I mean, this is so powerfully written. I will state for this, just for openness and transparency, Karen McLeod is someone I know personally, and I've taken part in her writing workshop. I think she's phenomenal anyway. But this book, even then, completely blew my socks off, because there's something so tender in the way that she writes about those darkest places that I found utterly compelling and heartbreaking, but really beautifully done. Particularly without spoiling anything, towards the end of the book, when she is reckoning with both her romantic relationships, her her problems with alcohol, and also her growing desire to be a writer and how that conflicts with these things, about how she realized there was something bigger than all of that she needed to do, and that was to be a writer, and hence we have this wonderful book. It's a really bold and brave piece of writing. I can't imagine laying myself that bare on the page, and doing so beautifully, and with so much heart. But I think this book really, I'm getting emotional now. It doesn't help because I know, Karen, that this touches an extra sort of nerve, but this is a fantastic piece of writing, and I really urge you to go and check it out. Next up, we have Queer as Folklore by Sacha Coward, and this is a really beautiful and fantastic set of interrogations, essentially, into the various parts of folklore, the various tales that we tell ourselves, and how they map with the queer experience. So particularly how often many LGBTQIA+ people will turn to stories to find themselves in them, and sometimes finding themselves in the least expected ways. So this book takes certain tropes of folklore and looks at them through a queer lens and a queer experience. And what I think is particularly special about this book is it is not afraid to really cast the net out wide and look for tales and tropes from all across the ages and cultures and various other things. So we have various myths and tropes and stories from across the world all coming into this. We have a broad range from across LGBTQIA+ identities, and we also have various different time frames. So we look at old myths and how those have shaped things. We also look at aliens and sci-fi and how things like that have shaped how we tell stories and how we think about ourselves. And I think it's just such a beautiful collection of tropes. Again, it could be, this is a book that I think in the wrong hands could so easily have been a really tired set of tropes of like, oh look, some people feel othered, here's a story about othering. I think the book goes much deeper. It looks into really some parts that I would never have stopped and thought about as being linked to the queer experience, but actually there's a really compelling argument in the book for those. I think what's also very clever about this book is the way that it is able to loop together and link up together various parts of understanding, but also be a compelling story. Sacha Coward, I think, is a natural born storyteller, and so the way he frames each chapter feels like its own little fable. And I just think it's gorgeous. I think it's a really beautiful and important piece of writing as well. Next up, a significantly darker book, and a really difficult one to read, but a really important one. The Lasting Harm by Lucia Osborne-Crowley. This book was a gut punch in many ways. It's an incredibly challenging book, but I think in all the right ways. Essentially, the book is... So Lucia works as a courtside reporter. So she is there in the courtroom of big cases and uses that to write about what's happening, to offer further thoughts, and to analyse what's been going on. And she was there for the trial of Ghislaine Maxwell, who was a former partner and accomplice to Jeffrey Epstein. And so, as you can tell, this book is not going to be a light one, but this is so stunningly done. It's a lot. I get really emotional thinking about this book because of the power of what's inside it. So in her work as a courtside reporter, she is very good firstly at summing up what has been happening so far, what the context is around the case, but she particularly focuses on many of the survivors of the abuse who are coming forward to share their stories as testimonials against Ghislaine Maxwell. And in doing so, she tells these stories of how the women who stood up to talk about their abuse were treated, not only by the court system, but also by the media, by the Ghislaine Maxwell team themselves, and all these other things. And so you have these harrowing parts in the book where these women are boldly standing up to tell their side of the story and are being really shamed or attacked by the defense attorneys. and it's really uncomfortable reading. It's really difficult. I listened to this as an audiobook, and there was a period walking through London where I had to just stop physically for a minute or two just to kind of get myself together, because this was so intense. A really bold piece of writing. This is incredible how she's able to take some of the legal jargon that I don't understand. I think many lay people wouldn't understand for what it all means, and takes that to really interrogate what has been happening to these women, and how their treatment through the court speaks to a wider culture of how we treat victims and survivors. And the end of this book, I think, is also where it elevates itself to an extra level of being incredible, where it suddenly looks at how we reform systems like the legal system or reporting systems or various other things to ensure that what happened to these women and the repeated difficulties they had in telling their stories and in being heard do not happen again. And it's difficult reading, don't get me wrong. This is a hard book to stomach, but a really exceptional one, I think, as well. So on to something lighter, 40 Lies by David Shenton. And I unfortunately don't have my physical copy of this anymore, but this is a graphic novel, graphic autobiography memoir of David Shenton's life. And of course, parts of it are talking about the difficulties for him. He grew up, growing up as a gay man in particularly many of the parts of history he's talking about, the 70s and 80s, are exceptionally difficult for not only what's going on around him, but losing loved ones to HIV and AIDS and various other things happening in this book. But the visual style of this book, as you can tell, hopefully from the cover that I've put here magically, and the general tone of this book is so fun. It has this almost punk energy of kind of like a folksy punk. He is talking about all of the parts of his life, the really joyous parts. There's a lot of humor in this. It's exceptionally funny. It also has various crochet and knitting patterns peppered in, because that's something that he's really into. And so this book is just a joy, and it feels in many ways like a warm hug from a queer elder, and it is exceptional, and I think it's wonderful. I really loved reading this. I think this was a real highlight for me this year, and I think I read it quite early into the year, so it was also quite a nice starter to everything. Next up, we have Revolutionary Acts, Love and Brotherhood in Black Gay Britain by Jason Okundaye. And I loved this. I think this is such a warm breath of fresh air. No, what's the phrase? You know what I mean. It's such a joyous book, whilst also dealing with some real difficulties. So in this book, Jason Okundaye has interviewed many black gay men from basically who are around and active in nightlife or in queer life in the 70s, 80s and 90s in particular. And he talks a lot about how these black gay men forged these communities that were really nourishing and supportive, but were also an act of resistance, because they were facing racism from within the gay community and in the wider world as well. They were facing homophobia within some parts of their sort of local black communities as well. And so they had to find these ways of existing to really keep themselves safe, but also to find joy and love and all these other things. And what I think really shines through in this book, not only apart from the difficulties that these men speak about, is also the joy. There's one man, I can't remember his name for the life of me, who is just still, I think he's maybe 60 or 70 when he's being interviewed by Jason Okundaye, and is just flirting outrageously with him. And reading this interview between the two of them is just brilliant, because you can just see Jason sort of being like, oh, thank you. That's very kind. But it is hilarious, but also just such a beautiful love letter to these men who were part of really making sure that a lot of people had community and had people to turn to. And I just think this is a fantastic book. I think this is so necessary to talk about a section of queer and Black lives that don't often have as much of a spotlight shone on them, but also just it's such a raucous, fun read at the same time. Next up, I read An African History of Africa by Zeinab Badawi. And this book, I think, is exceptional in many, many ways. It takes something that feels so huge, the history of an entire continent, and it tries to reframe so many of the ways we often talk about Africa. And I say this as someone living in the UK, where so much of the way that news will speak about the continent is quite patronizing. It's quite surreal in the way that it reframes it. I mean, firstly, it always refers to Africa as a continent and not as a collection of many different nations with different histories and what have you. But also there's a slightly detached element to the way it's often viewed. And so, again, speaking for myself, growing up in the UK, I learnt so much about various parts of UK history, which is to be expected, living in the UK. But the only other times that Africa was brought up in history was either to talk about the ancient Egyptians or to talk about slavery. And this book feels like a dialogue with that, to kind of combat the one-sided framing of history. And so this takes various pockets of history of talking about ancient rulers or sort of mini empires or what have you, but it also really focuses in on some of the smaller, more interesting parts that I would never otherwise have really found out much about. So one part that really stuck with me is the book talks about how trading using cowrie shells as a currency was a really important and really prominent part of many cultures' trading practices. And that was an early version of currency, and it had an exceptionally advanced way of working. People iterated on it bit by bit, and it became this thing that was really highly functional. It could be used across borders because cowrie shells were, not a coin that had a monarch's face on it. They were something that could be interchanged, and there was an understanding of how that could be used. And she talks about in this book how there was then, for example, through empire, currencies placed upon nations, and then people then wondering why things went awry when you've kind of sort of put upon a set of people an entirely new economy and just expected it to work overnight. And she does state, obviously, not everything was perfect. She doesn't approach this book with the idea that all of the countries in the African continent were really thriving and then everything happened with empire and colonialism. But she does speak a lot about how the various changes of what colonialism brought were really deeply painful to people's ways of life, that something was suddenly overnight put upon people, and their ability inability to immediately cope with what was happening to them was then treated as evidence of who they were as people, genetically. And that is so divorced from reality. And so I think this book does a really great job of arguing back from that perspective to say, well, actually, if you had a perfectly functioning economy and somebody came in and did all these other things, well, of course, everything's going to go to rack and ruin almost immediately. But she also talks a lot about innovation and how, particularly in the modern day, many of the big emerging economies out of Africa, so particularly places like Nigeria, are really innovating in these huge ways, but often that doesn't get looked at in quite the same way as other nations. So I think this is a really interesting rebuttal of a book, and also makes a case for really resisting a singular story of Africa. And I think it's really successful in doing so. And now we get to the portion that is the Women's Prize for Nonfiction shortlist and longlist. So many of the books that were on the shortlist this year could have been in my top books of the year. I think it's one of the strongest book prize shortlists I've seen pretty much ever. And the only reason that one of the winner by Naomi Klein, the book Doppelganger, isn't on this list is because it was on my best of non-fiction list last year. And actually, had I read it this year, it would have been there as well. It's a fantastic book. But anyway, to talk about the Women's Prize shortlist and long list, I've had to cut this down a little bit, but there are a few that really, really stuck out to me. One of which being How to Say Babylon by Safiya Sinclair. This is an incredible piece of writing. It's a memoir of her as a young woman, particularly as someone who wanted to be a writer, to kind of explore all these things. And the really difficult life that she grew up around, because although there was a lot of love in many other ways, she grew up in quite a hostile environment at times, to put it mildly, really. She grew up in a Rastafari community, and again, nothing explicitly about that means that everything else that follows had to happen, but she talks about how explicitly within that, her father saw himself as this sort of head of the house in a particularly domineering way, and it meant that there was a lot of there were a lot of harsh rules placed upon Safiya Sinclair to be a certain person, and particularly for women to behave in a certain way. And she, as someone who resists that, found that she ran up against a lot of difficulty within the household. And a lot of this book is her finding her voice as a writer and as a woman, but also her trying to unpick some of the difficult relationship she's had with her father. And I think actually, again, without spoiling any parts of this book, I think what's particularly special about this book is the way that she is able to find compassion and empathy for her father, despite the really troubled relationship that they've had in many ways. It's a really difficult read at times, but such an important one. And I think this is just such an incredible piece of writing. Next up from the long list, Marianne Brooker with Intervals. And this is a book as well that perhaps I was more predestined to like as well, because of how it interacts with my own life. But the personal resonance aside, I think this is a phenomenal piece of writing. Fitzcarraldo is great at finding those books that are, and championing those books that are kind of intersection of two or three or multiple different arguments and thoughts. And so in this book, we have Marianne Brooker talking about care and being a carer for her mother, but also about the various ways that that throws up questions about life and the right to end life, and various other huge conversations. And this book does this in about 200 pages, but really intersects with these particularly difficult conversations, but finds something really innovative and clever to say about them. It interrogates this idea of what it means to have control over your life, and at what point a conversation about assisted dying or whatever else might come into the picture. And she does such an exceptional job, I think, of arguing that, but also finding real compassion. It's at times this is a book where she is talking about assisted dying and having a more academic conversation about the wider implications of those things. A lot of the book is also personal stories of her dealing with her mum's dwindling health and the ways that she conceptualizes her own relationship with her mother because of that. It's so beautifully done and really thought-provoking, and I just think an exceptional argument and piece of writing. Next up, Matrescence by Lucy Jones. And this book really blew me away because it's something that I'd never come across really before, or well, friends of mine who have been pregnant have expressed some of these thoughts, but to see it with an academic backing in this book and also the personal story of Lucy Jones, I thought was phenomenal. So Matrescence talks about a chemical reaction to some degree of what happens after somebody has given birth, where the hormones and various things within their body in many ways physically alter their chemical composition as people. And so she writes about herself as a mother, of how after she was born, so many parts of her mind and body reacted to having to look after this little one that's around there. So she found that she had immense amounts of brain fog, but also her mind was able to really intensely focus on looking after this little one. And she found that parts of her body would change in terms of her body essentially accommodating being able to look after a newborn, not only in terms of the things you might expect, like milk or whatever, but just even her kind of body composition in terms of adipose tissue and fat, and her long-term focus or whatever. All of these things happened, as well as, for example, a heightened sense of smell or taste, or all of these things. And I thought this book was so fascinating on both a scientific level about what it says about this phenomena and this experience of matrescence, but also what that means in terms of how the medical system often treats people who've just given birth, the way that we often that many women's stories are not believed by medical people. I mean, in general, really, women's stories are not often believed by the medical field. That's a whole other conversation. But I think this book engages with what that really looks like, where actually knowing what your body is going through as you're doing that is both a right, that you should be told a lot of these things of what to expect, but equally it's such an understudied field comparatively, and so that speaks again to how often women's bodies are sidelined within some medical practices or medical research or whatever else. And so I think this book is both a clarion call of an argument for what should be done, but also such a deeply personal and heartfelt account of her pregnancy and her moments after birth as well. I just think this is a really eye-opening for what friends of mine have been through when they've given birth. That, yeah, just the sheer chemical changes to the body are wild. She does talk a little bit about matrescence and what that looks like often for fathers in this situation. It's less immediate or direct in the same way. It's, you know, that there are chemical changes that still happen within sort of in men's bodies around this as well, but it doesn't really necessarily compare to what that looks like on a very physical level for people who are carrying a child, and what that does chemically to your body. So yeah, I thought this was really interesting, and a really beautiful book. And last but very much not least, A Flat Place by Noreen Masud. And this is a beautiful memoir that in many ways intersplices, I don't know if that's a word, mixes in lots of conversations about other things. So ostensibly this is a book both about nature and about mental health for Noreen Masud herself. And she talks about how going through periods of mental ill health, certain parts of nature and its landscapes affected how she viewed herself and how she was able to reconcile many of the things happening. And that's one part of this book. It's a big part of the book, those two topics. But in doing so, she goes into many other things. So in talking about mental health, she explores what it means to really be well, what it means to have an understanding of your own health and various other things, and how we treat people who are going through it or who are particularly unwell at some point in their life. But we also have a conversation with the nature part about what it means to call a place home. She talks in this book about her relationship with her father quite a lot. And in many ways, her father is also a stand-in for her conversations about her sense of place and where she's from. And she compares the UK and Pakistan in this book in these really interesting ways of both feeling like home but not being, and both of them give her something but also don't have something else. And her move between them and her relationship with her father is very intricately linked to place. And so A Flat Place is also her exploration of how a changing physical environment and her changing mental state are both interlinked and also affect one another quite considerably. So her mental health might change how she sees a place, but that place might also change how her mental health is as she's there. And this book, I think, explores them in such beautiful honesty. It's a brutally honest book. It's exceptionally difficult reading, again, at times, because of how she talks about the things that she's been going through. But I think this is such a bold and honest book. And I think the way it explores identity and how you can really find a sense of rootedness and place is fascinating, because she, in many ways, is very good at it because she's had to be, but also struggles massively with understanding what she can really call home. And I think it's an exceptional piece of writing. So those are the books that I have put in my top 12, 13 if you include both volumes of Some Men in London. I really enjoyed my non-fiction reading this year. I was really hoping to read Question 7 by Richard Flanagan before the end of the year. It's still somewhere in transit between my library and another library. But that is a book that I feel I would have loved as well. So I'm intrigued to read it, and maybe it'll end up in the 2025 list. Who knows? But either way, it's been a fantastic year of non-fiction reading for me. Again, it's very much shaped by Women's Prize reading and by various bits of queer non-fiction. In many ways, that's what most years look like for me as well, anyway. But I'm really excited to see what comes up next in 2025. I know that some authors I love are probably going to release other non-fiction books in the coming year. I know that Sean Fay has a book coming out. So yeah, very excited to see what's coming up. But I'd love to hear your thoughts as well on books that I've maybe overlooked or missed from across the year. And I would love to get some extra recommendations. Regardless, have a wonderful end of year. I hope you're doing really well, and take care. Have a wonderful New Year's, and see you in 2025. Bye bye.